The next paper, this is going to be given to us by Ailya Vajid, who's currently a student at the College of Medicine and Healing Arts, pursuing a diploma in Unani Tib, medicine. Previously, she has served as a university chaplain at several institutions. In her work, Ailya has committed to connecting to the depths of our human selves and to witnessing that humanity and divine presence in each person as we engage across difference and through the challenges we face in our world. In her studies in Tib and somatic healing, Ailya seeks to pursue a holistic approach to wellness and healing that addresses the body, mind, soul, and spirit, bringing care and restoration to the whole self. So very much in line with the theme of our conference. Ailya holds a BA in Religion and Islamic Studies from Swarthmore College and an MA in Theological Studies with a focus in Islamic Studies from Harvard Divinity School. And her paper is entitled Trials as Transformation, Islamic Chaplaincy and the Problem of Human Suffering. So without further delay, we open up the floor to our speaker.
Thank you. Thank you so much first to Drs. Farouk and Rustam for organizing this meaningful conference and for this wonderful opportunity to be a part of it. It's such a pleasure to be with all of you today. And you can hear me all right?
Yep.
Okay, great.
Yes.
Also, just before I start, I have to agree with Dr. Boylston. I feel such a resonance with the past few presentations and this panel in particular. I had actually contemplated the guest house for Dr. Latif, and then I didn't have a chance to uplift love or just the realness of suffering itself and the realness of that crack that you described. So I'm grateful to be coming in the wake of these incredibly meaningful reflections and hope that they'll kind of be held as I begin. All right, suffering and surrender and suffering, trusting that Allah was going to see me through that moment of loss of a beloved one. I begged for his mercy after having tasted his power. I reflected on death and how not prepared I was to face it. His mercy healed me as I was surrendered to him. He is the only one who has power over everything, and we must surrender to the destiny he designed for us. Be patient and know that death may come at any time. These are some reflections from a community member after the loss of her mother, and I thought we'd just begin with that and hold a moment of lived experience before we move into some background, as I'm not going to bring in the other narratives until closer to the end. So this paper uplifts stories of human suffering, focusing on how college and graduate students navigate the trials in their lives and the ways that this hardship engenders great growth and transformation and helps facilitate their coming into themselves and who they truly are. In witnessing their journeys, we'll even explore the notion that perhaps suffering is actually necessary to becoming who we truly are, because without it, perhaps we would not have the occasion to go inward, to question ourselves and perhaps God, and in our brokenness to discover ourselves and find our purpose. Thus, perhaps suffering is inherent to the process of becoming who we truly are, to connecting to our fiṭra, to our primordial self within, and in this becoming, living as our true self. I've served as a college and university chaplain for the past almost 8 years, and in this role, I've had the great blessing of walking alongside college students in their life journeys and being present for them through their joys, through their hardships, through their grief, their suffering, their spiritual journeys, through figuring out who they are and who they would like to be and how they want to contribute in the world. And it has been such a gift and privilege to bear witness to this as they are in this delicate transitional moment of their lives, navigating faith, life, and who they are, often for the first time away from their homes and families. I should probably add that that I've considered this role as a chaplain not to be one that's prescriptive, that guides or even actively advises students on how to walk through their suffering, but rather one of bearing witness, as Hina Khalid so beautifully described yesterday, as one of compassionate presence that holds space for them as they experience some of life's greatest challenges, providing space for them to do their own processing. And we have discussion circles where we bring forth notions of God's mercy, love, and immanence, which Sarah brought up so beautifully earlier, much of which was missing in the understandings of Islam growing up for them. And it's really, for me, chaplaincy is giving them the space to be where they need to be, whether knee deep in the pain, on the other side of it, or somewhere in between, and just bearing witness to that and being a presence of compassion as they do their processing and perhaps get to the other side of it. So during my time as a chaplain, though, I've experienced, again, the great honor and blessing of witnessing their journeys towards discovering themselves. And what I've seen is that it is their suffering that deepens, strengthens, and even accelerates this journey of self-knowledge. Again, it is their suffering that connects them to the depths of themselves and who they truly are. While suffering causes great pain and distress, it can also inspire deep awakening within us. We can draw closer to God and become aware of ourselves, of the world around us, and our purpose in life. For some, their suffering, whether around identity, ability, childhood, relationships, family challenges, it helps bring meaning to and charts the course of their lives as they seek to support and alleviate the suffering of others, choosing careers in nonprofit, law, psychology, and others. For many, this transformation is deeper than their outward lives. It touches their inward journeys of self as they cultivate and embody deep virtues, these virtues which reflect the names of God, and they walk the path of returning to their true self, their fiṭra or their primordial disposition turned towards God. So in order to address suffering, let's first take a step back and reflect on the underlying purpose of life. Once we understand our purpose, then we can place suffering and better understand its role in our lives. So who are we as humans? Why do we exist? And what role do our life experiences play in fulfilling this purpose? On an individual level, there are countless ways to draw meaning from life, fulfilling the human trust to care for the earth and its creatures, struggling for justice, spreading knowledge, and so on and so forth. On a metaphysical level, however, human beings were created to know, worship, and love the divine. In a hadith qudsi that I think Dr. Latif shared with us, God relates, "I was a hidden treasure and I love to be known, so I created creation to know me." Moreover, the Quran states, "I did not create the jinn and humankind except to worship me." According to these foundational texts, then, we exist to worship the divine, to know him, to love him. God created human beings because he loved to be known. So the purpose of human existence is this very knowledge of the divine. In the Quran, God relates that we can know him through his signs, which he reveals upon the horizons and within ourselves. Thus, God is known through the cosmos, through the celestial bodies, as well as the night and the day, the stars and the moon, the meeting of salt and fresh water, and all of the signs of the created order referred to throughout the Quran. God is known through the divine names. The cosmos manifests into the world through its very existence. For example, God's beauty is manifested in a rose, his majesty in the mountains, his mercy in rain. All of the cosmos reflects God's qualities if we learn to perceive them, or as the Quran says, for those who understand, لِقَوْمٍ يَعْقِلُونَ. Alongside the macrocosm, God is known through the microcosm, through the human being, who him or herself is a very reflection of the macrocosm and thus of God's names and qualities. Ali ibn Abi Talib elucidates, I think a lot of people have probably heard this one, your remedy is within you, but you do not sense it. Your sickness is from you, but you do not perceive it. You presume you are a small entity, but within you is enfolded the entire universe. You are indeed the evident book by whose alphabet the hidden becomes manifest. Therefore, you have no need to look beyond yourself. What you seek is within you, if you only reflect. Thus, humans embody the entirety of existence within themselves. According to the Quran, God breathes of his spirit into each human being, and in the words of the Prophet, human beings were made in God's image. Thus, human beings carry the very spirit of the divine within, themselves a reflection of the divine reality. Moreover, the Quran states that human beings were created in ahsani taqweem, the highest form. However, placed in the world with free will, human beings have the choice to live according to their fiṭra, their self that embodies virtues, reflecting divine qualities, and who knows, worships, and loves God, or to live in forgetfulness of their true self within. This knowledge of and connection to the divine is contained within the human heart, which according to Dr. Sayyid Hussein Nasr, from whom we've heard yesterday and has been present with us in some way today as well, the heart is the center of our being on all the different levels of our existence, both the corporeal and emotive, as well as the intellectual and spiritual. Moreover, the heart is the barzakh, or isthmus, between this world and the next, between the visible and invisible worlds, between the human realm and the realm of the spirit. It is the place where God penetrates our microcosmic existence. In other words, the locus for the breath of God. This is where the ruh, or spirit, resides, where God's names are manifested within each human being. In a hadith Qudsi, God relays that God himself is encompassed by the human heart. The heavens and the earth cannot contain me, but the heart of my faithful servant contains me. And I think Dr. Nas yesterday also referred to the saying of the prophet that the heart of the believer is the throne of the all-merciful. Thus, within the human being resides not only the entire cosmos, but the very presence of the divine. However, according to the Sufi tradition, the divine presence, or primordial self, that as a soul testified to God's lordship, is veiled, covered by the rust of the world and human forgetfulness. And the purpose of life is to walk the journey of knowing oneself by removing the rust on the mirror of the heart through cultivating remembrance, worship, love, virtue, and knowledge of the divine. For according to the prophet, he who knows himself knows his Lord. If human beings were created ultimately to know the divine, then every joy, every hardship, every love, every sorrow, every experience, every moment exists for us to know God. Human suffering then becomes a part of this journey of awakening, of knowing, of witnessing, of connecting, of being. So we'll shift from cosmology into a little bit of a theology of suffering. Suffering has always been a part of the human condition. Almost every religious tradition speaks of suffering as a central facet of life in the world. In the Islamic tradition, the Quran tells us that the dunya, the world, is a temporary abode of distraction and delusional enjoyment, filled with various trials and hardships. The Quran says, "So long as you are in the world, be not surprised at the existence of sorrows, for truly it manifests nothing but what is in keeping with its character or inevitable nature." Moreover, the Quran states, "And we will indeed test you with something of fear and hunger and loss of wealth, souls, and fruits, and give glad tidings to the patient, those who, when affliction befalls them, say, truly we are God's, and unto him we return." We've heard that one a couple times today as well. According to the Islamic worldview, the world is a place of suffering, as it is separate from God. Only with the divine can one be in true peace and contentment. Human beings are not made only for the world, and it is not the ultimate destination. The prophet said to be in the world as a traveler. Rather, it is a stop along the way that shapes us, and through our actions and deeds determines the nature of the longer abode in the hereafter. To the extent that we attach ourselves to the world, we find ourselves unhappy. At the same time, as we discussed, the world can be a reflection of God's names and qualities, a place for spiritual wayfaring to the divine. If one walks the path to God and engages the inner work of emptying oneself of attachment to the world, and can begin to witness God in everything in the world. As human beings, we seek joy, peace, contentment, comfort, and security, but we do not realize that we cannot experience this on the deepest level until we stop seeking them in the world and discover them in the divine. It is by dying to these attachments that we experience the greatest freedom and the greatest peace. In emptying ourselves of the world and turning towards the divine, we realign with our fiṭra, finding God here and now before the meeting in the hereafter. This emptying, detachment, and return to God most often takes place through our greatest suffering, as this is what annihilates the ego, which is actually what causes our suffering in the first place. However, the slaying of the nafs is a painful process, and it causes great agony and adversity. For some, it can even bring about a turning away from the divine. For others, it is exactly what draws them even closer to the divine. In the Islamic paradigm, God tests those most beloved to him, as it is a way of strengthening their faith and surrender, engendering growth and drawing them closer. According to a saying of the prophet, if God wants to do good to somebody, he afflicts them with trials. There are several stories throughout the Quran of the prophets being tested, as well as the life of the prophet himself and his early community. We don't have time to get into them now, but if we just briefly reflect on the life of the prophet, we witness his suffering as he spreads the message of Islam, which was not considered a punishment or a way of distancing from the divine, but rather this suffering shaped him and allowed him to serve as a model of how to walk through suffering. his example an embodiment of mercy and goodness and compassion. Moreover, it was in fact after the year of sorrow in which he lost both his wife Khadija and his uncle Abu Talib that the Prophet ascended to the heavens during the Isra wa Mi'raj, reminding human beings that following one's deepest hardship can be one's greatest ascension. It is in our moments of tragedy, hardship, and grief that we often find ourselves closest to the divine. So we'll turn now to discovering God in suffering. In the Hadith of Resurrection, which Hina Khalid shared with us yesterday, I felt a lot of resonances, by the way, in our work. So I hope we get to connect. So in the Hadith of Resurrection, God says, "O son of Adam, I fell ill and you visited me not." And he responds, "O Lord, and how should I visit you when you are the Lord of the worlds?" God will say, "Did you not know that my servant so-and-so had fallen ill and you visited him not? Did you not know that had you visited him, you would have found me with him?" And this repeats for food and drink. In this hadith, God relates that he is with those who are suffering. And if any person were to be present and care for those in need, he or she would indeed find the divine with them. Although God relates that he is with the suffering, do people indeed perceive and find God in their suffering? While human beings always have the opportunity to remember God, it is most often through suffering and hardship that souls turn towards the divine. Amidst the fullness of life and the illusion of control, it is easy to get distracted and forget God. And even when we do remember, it is still in suffering that we give most fully of ourselves in this remembrance and surrender. It is often in suffering that we truly find God. Sometimes our hardships break us down and even challenge our faith. And other times, as we are broken and brought down to our knees to the deepest prostration with the sincerest of tears, we realize that only God can relieve us of our hardship and our burdens. Professor Boylston referred to the saying that it is through the wound or through the crack that God's light shines into us. So thus, it is through the adversity that we may experience God's light and mercy even more fully. This pain and suffering also begin to challenge the ego, which stands defiant in its arrogance and self-reliance. Helpless in these moments, we are humbled as we realize that we do what we can in the world. As the hadith says, we tie our camel. And then truly all we can do is leave things in the hands of God to care for us and to bring us relief. Suddenly we remember God more than we did at any other moment, worshiping him more sincerely, turning to him for mercy, comfort, love, ease, and relief from our trial. We experience awareness and gratitude for the gifts we have, and we develop virtues, these reflections of divine qualities, such as patience and peace and our trust and surrender. Ibn Ata'illah al-Iskandari reflects on this in his hikam. You will perhaps find benefit in distress, which you have not been able to find in fasting nor in prayer. Therefore, when it descends upon you, defend yourself no longer and do not be concerned with the searching for some remedy, lest you drive away the good which comes toward you freely and give up your will entirely to your Lord. Then you will see marvels. And I love that Professor Latif earlier kind of gave us the two different kinds of suffering, so we can hold that in some context as well. Students have shared such experiences of their deepest turning to and discovering God in these moments of adversity, helplessness, and anguish. Through their struggle, they begin to know and connect to God as they experience divine presence, mercy, love, peace, and proximity. So we'll turn now to some of their narratives. And I've changed the names. So, all right. Hava has passed through several great challenges throughout her life and college career, particularly around mental health, identity, and an abusive relationship with her mother. As she approaches her college graduation, she is discovering great peace in who she is, as she receives answers to her lifelong struggles, revealed to her by God, she shares. Throughout her life, Hava has endured several mental health challenges, including anxiety, ADHD, depression, PTSD, and she was recently diagnosed with autism. This has been an incredibly difficult yet meaningful journey for her, as it turned her towards God even more fervently, deepened her relationship with him, and helped her come to a place of true self-acceptance and love. As she entered high school and then college, she turned to God for answers and relief. At a certain point, she found herself begging God to make her like everyone else and to guide her through this. She felt God's presence in helping her not only accept herself, but also love, value, and cherish herself in the way that he made her. Hava explains that it was in her moments of deepest desperation that she would turn to God most fully, humbly, and truly, recognizing in the very core of her being that it was only because of God that she exists. She says, all of these things in which you are deeply, utterly helpless, I would be like, God, you are literally the reason I breathe, I move, I have emotions. I know that because you have taken away all of these things and given them back. Humans can understand God in a way other beings can't. And Allah loves to be known, that whole thing you taught. Allah pulls me out of a thing so that I can see it from a completely different angle than before, and then puts me back. So I don't become attached to rules for the sake of rules. I become attached purely to God. This is what he was doing for me. Hardship helps me understand myself. It helps me with my entire life journey. It helps me be true to myself. It helps me trust God very deeply. It's given me a lot of faith. There would have been so many situations where when I was in between a rock and a hard place, and it was only God that would get me out of those situations. In her suffering, Hawa found herself embodying our aforementioned purpose of life as she turned to God in utter helplessness and humility, recognizing his lordship, as she did in her primordial state. She witnessed that God was taking her through this journey of hardship to find him, to know him, and attach to him, and that she could have not reached him without it. She says, the test that God is putting me through now is one of the ultimate tests of my trust in him. A test of my trust is also in myself and being able to put these two together. I would see God as this distant being. Now I can trust myself and trust God. Allah puts us through everything for something. Every difficulty was so I could turn to Allah and see myself in that place and experience God's great forgiveness and mercy. Along these lines, in his hikam, Ibn Ata'Allah relates, to soften for you the suffering of affliction, he has taught you that he is the one who causes the trials to come upon you. For the one who confronts you with his decrees of faith is the same one who accustomed you to his good choice. To experience trials as purposeful from God, for one's own growth and transformation, completely reframes one's suffering, infusing it with meaning. It reformulates suffering not as something to be avoided, but like every other experience bestowed by the divine, as something to be welcomed, because it will become the means for inner growth, to knowing God and to returning to one's true self. The next two narratives, I'll go through them kind of quickly, are of women who lost their mother, the first later in life, and then the second quite young. And we started with the first one, Fatima's narrative. So I'll just briefly give a little bit of that quote. Suffering and surrender, surrender and suffering, trusting that Allah was going to see me through that moment of loss of a beloved one. I begged for his mercy after having tasted his power. His mercy has healed me as I surrendered to him. In her surrender, Fatima discovered resilience. Surrender and trust are qualities that the faithful seek to embody before the divine, but it is not until one is tried that one can actually cultivate and embody such virtues. Human beings often chart the course of their lives with confidence, and it is not until one endures great suffering or loss that one begins to experience one's lack of control, as well as cultivate qualities such as humility, trust, and surrender before the divine. It is in this letting go that one experiences the greatest strength, because one no longer has to control, but can rest in trust and contentment in the divine will, and trust that the divine only brings good, even through hardship. Fatima experienced God's mercy through one of life's greatest difficulties, as we can only know mercy if we have experienced harshness or God's majesty. Just as the changing of night into day is a sign of God, and one cannot understand one without the other, so too is God's mercy and majesty. One cannot fully understand and appreciate God's names of mercy without also having experienced God's names of majesty. At one point, however, one can realize that there is in fact mercy in the majesty. For Fatima, God's mercy was experienced both through the grace that she felt from all those in her life who came forward to support her and care for her, as well as through the realization that she was not yet prepared for death. She felt this was an opportunity from the divine to further cultivate her spirituality, her emptiness, her trust, worship, and connection, so that when her moment of death came, she could be fully surrendered and ready to leave the world. Now we'll turn to Khadija, a graduate student who lost her mother in her early 30s. She walked through years of grief following the passing of her mother, the closest person to her. This has been one of the most difficult, heart-wrenching experiences of her life, and she explains the most transformative. She expresses the way it deepened her relationship with God. When you have no one else to turn to, you realize you can only turn to Allah. It was in her moment of great desperation, losing the person to whom she was closest in the world, that she was brought down to her knees in prostration and tears and turned to Allah, embodying true sincerity, humility, trust, and connection. Losing the person who was everything for her made her realize that there is only God to turn to. She relates that she can now face life's continued challenges with perspective, humility, trusting God, groundedness, and strength, knowing that she always has somewhere to turn for support and that God will always bring what is best for her. Khadija shares further on how losing her mother completely spiritually transformed her. It has been the center of her life experience, and rather than distancing her from the divine, although naturally she experienced the waves of anger, disbelief, rage, heartache, and agony throughout, it helped her realize her own shirk, she said, as she witnessed her great dependence on her mother rather than on God. It's a humbling experience to see myself in the greatest sin, she reflected. The following is a poem she wrote that spans the fullness and richness of her outward and inward journey through her mother's passing. In the interest of time, we'll just read a few lines here and then I'll close. How deep is this darkness? How dark is this night? Where are you, Allah? Where's your light upon light? Nur ala nur, I keep reciting and searching for your grace and your mercy, the silence disconcerting. Allah, Allah, there can be nothing but you. The depths of disaster prove you to be true. Yet most only I see the opposite. They deny you in pain. I feel only pain when I feel you. Alas, no pain, no gain. Living my comfortable life, I sat in denial. Now when my comfort is ripped from me, I see the depths of my blessing. Comfort, safety, wealth upon wealth. How is it possible that we see you in stealth? Lies, all lies. How obvious it was that in our ghafla, we thought you were showing your displeasure on us. Every breath is a pleasure, every breath that's in pain. What existence except pain exists for the one ripped from their love. Revealed to you is Allah. Qul huwa Allahu ahad. Ahad, ahad, ahad. One, one, one. Don't you see yet? I'm not chasing my mom, I'm chasing the one. This is the same longing felt by Rumi, Shams, and our beloved. My heart drips with blood, raw and still beating. Yet this pain is what gives life. This pain is worth repeating. Over and over again, this pain is in each beat. Each breath, each exhale is the reliever of heat. The heat of life so different than the heat of death. Zahir wal batin, don't you see yet? It's all flipped on its head, the opposite is true. Now I see where the dervish runs through the flames and comes out cold blue. Everything is a facade, neither life exists nor death. In her inspired, heartfelt, true words, Khadija has given us a rich commentary on the spiritual life. The purpose of life, then, is sacrificing ourselves, which outwardly seems like the greatest loss, but is actually the means to true life as one truly returns to God. The Prophet said, "Die before you die." Thus, this journey of self-discovery on the deepest level is death to the part of ourself that veils us from our fiṭra, death to the self that veils us from our fiṭra, discovering life in God, witnessing God in everything in existence. Thank you.
Ailya, can you hear me? You can. You're good. All right, wonderful. Yes. That was very that was very moving. The last poem, especially by Khadija. Thank you for sharing everything, all of these insights with us, and really contextualizing them in a way that really not only kind of complements the other lectures, but also shows just why the kind of work that you're involved in is so important for our time. And every human being suffers, every human being feels pain. The question is, where are they going to go? Who are they going to turn to? As you were speaking, I remember this one story in the Masnavi, which really consoled me when I was, in my early 20s, I guess, just trying to figure out life. And there was this one poem. He's describing in this poem the prayer gestures and the what each prayer gesture means. When you stand up, it's like you're standing before God in the resurrection. And then you can't stand, so you fall down, and then he makes you get up again, and then you go back down. And at the end of the prayer, you're sitting in front of God and you're trembling. And then and what Sunnis do, and some Shias as well, they do the salams this way, that way, and then normally then you put your hands up in dua, right? So he says that what's happening here is this person on that final day, but also in life all together, he's standing before God and he doesn't know what to do. So he looks this way and he realizes no one's there to help him. Then he looks this way and he realizes there's no one to help him. And then he puts his hand up and he asks God to. And so we that constant reminder is very, very important. And you pointed up very well the perspective of what suffering can do and where it can take us in this very positive way. Wonderful, thank you. Now we're going to open up the floor. We have a good 15 minutes, so we're right on schedule. And comments, questions, a lot of gratitude coming through in the chat. Sarah Aziz, thanks you for these insights. Hina Khalid says, so rich, so beautiful, thank you. And some tears, and Muhammad Farooq mentions that this was a very moving poem, the last one he was referring to especially, and so on and so forth. Are there any comments or questions? Don't let me hog this thing, because I have a lot of questions. So
I have a comment, a question too. So I was just wondering, I mean, these are all really very meaningful experiences, and also the teachings that you shared, they really kind of put things into perspective, what one should be doing, and it's really, really comprehensive. But I was wondering, how about some of us who might not feel like, you may not have much even faith in God, or you may feel like nothing is working. You're just falling down and down. Or so, what would be some of the concrete advice for those people in those kind of situations? Yeah, were you able to hear me, and can you respond? Oh, just
I had to get unmuted. Okay, thank you. That's a really important question. And the way that I've approached it, I don't know if there's ever an answer, but the way I mostly work with people from a certain worldview. I work with a lot of students of faith, but I certainly work with some who are not. And the way that I've approached that is just kind of meeting the person where they are. So, if someone's in the midst of suffering and they don't have the God-centric worldview that's going to provide some solace, it's, I think what a couple of people have said, both yesterday and today, of bearing witness to that, being a compassionate presence to that, being able to just, be a presence that holds what they're sharing. And if they're in a space for tools to wanting to process that, then we do that together. But a lot of it I've found is just holding space for the suffering, and the person themselves, get to a place where over time they come to some healing. There are some people, who will get stuck in that. And, as I'm doing these studies in somatic healing, I'm finding that sometimes the victimhood even becomes a part of us, right? So that we want to move past it, but it actually has become a part of my identity now. And it's almost scary to move out of it because it's all I've known for so long. And in those, cases, you have to give people, at least I feel like I have to give people the space to be where they are, and start to give them, if there's a space for notions of the possibility of something else. Like when I've worked with students in discussion circles, I'm not telling them, all right, now you have to get over your suffering. God is bringing you closer, right? We talk about these things because that's quite unhelpful, right? But we talk about these, meaningful things of God's immanence, of God's mercy, of God's love, things that they may not have been exposed to before. And, and that might give them space. Again, for someone who's not coming from the framework of God, I think it's bearing witness to their suffering. And then lately, as I've been doing studies in somatic healing, I'm finding that so much of our suffering, although we think it's in the head, because, in the modern world, we process everything through thinking, a lot of it's actually embodied. And so what are the techniques then to release the suffering from the body? Because actually that in itself might bring, a shift, an energetic shift, a body shift, in which we're not living through the lens of that suffering anymore. It's no longer a part of us. And so I think those kinds of tools then can maybe begin to help when we're not bringing in a God conscious lens.
Yeah, exactly. I was just a follow-up comment, and then I guess someone else has a question. Yeah, you already mentioned it, somatic healing, and you can see in a lot of in many other approaches too. I mean, people advise kind of physical exercise and other practices that has to do with the body. So because a lot of the times when you are exposed to this kind of insights, talks, it might give you the impression that it's all kind of mental and spiritual. There's, as you said, we are embodied beings, and so the body is important. But I think Hina did mention that even the body. So that some of the teachings from the tradition in the Quran, Hadith, and in other places, they actually do involve the body. For example, touching the sick person, just touch, or being in the presence of visiting him. These are not mental actions. These are concrete physical actions. And thanks for mentioning the somatic dimension. I think that's also extremely important and complementary. Thank you.
Yeah, very good. Thank you. Amir, did you have a question or a comment?
Yes, a comment and a question as well. Thank you, Mohammed. Thanks, Ailya. That was really beautiful and very moving. It's been amazing couple of days so far. You really brought us to the lives of young people and help us really live that to some degree. I was reminded of the beautiful poem. I think when Muhammad Rustam was talking, I thought he was going to mention this poem. So that since it came up, I wanted to mention it. You mentioned something else that's beautiful. There's so much in Maulana Rumi. So this is the story of the dervish who's sitting and doing the zikr, the remembrance of God, with a lot of fervor and a lot of joy. And he's saying, Allah, Allah, Allah. And Satan comes and sits next to him and just starts to go like, oh yeah, how beautiful. Look at that. You're doing such a great zikr. I really hear how well you're doing it, but I don't hear God responding to you. I do not hear God's response, So I was reminded of that in reading, was it Khadija? I think one of the poems, very poignant, Yeah. And so that trap, which we see, in some ways it's a trap, in other ways it's a real need, because our bodies are in a world of bodies and just subject and objects. We need somebody to touch us. We need to hear a voice, So that's where we look for the answer. But then Rumi goes ahead and gives another answer. So the guy, it's like his heart is this, precious house made out of glass, and Satan's words that waswasized and it's broken that heart, made the house of glass, and he's totally shattered to the degree starts sobbing and crying and falls into a deep sleep after being totally exhausted. And in the dream, Rumi says, an angel appears to him and says that God has sent me to tell my servant that his calling out to me is my answer to him. How can you remember me if I were not already remembering you? And so that's just personally speaking, and I feel like just in this domain, like in keeping with especially this panel, this relationship between the uncaused and the caused, needing succor, support, solace at this human level, as Hina has also spoken about, you've spoken out beautifully about that. And then the recognition that the answer was different than what one was looking for. I wonder if there are moments. So my question now is, do those moments occur? Have you seen those moments where the need to have that kind of answer disappears in that way, where the recognition is that, oh, God is present with me. I recognize that God is present in a different way than I thought God was going to be present.
That's so all wonderful. Actually, I'm really glad you shared that story, because I don't know enough of the Masnavi. I don't like this much, but that's one of the stories I often bring to my students. So it makes me really happy that you brought it into the space. And I do find that they start to see God in all the different experiences of their lives. So the person, you know, the student of mine that has the panic attacks, there will be someone who shows up for her. And she sees God in that person who's there for her in that moment. Or she's someone, you know, who mashallah starts to see signs around her. She's someone who often really connects to spiders. And so, you know, when she sees a spider, she sees God, his presence in that, or she sees a sign of him as she's trying to, she's making a big decision recently. And she went into the forest and saw a spider and she thought, all right, you know, he's given me my answer. So I think they do start to, you know, it's what we were speaking about, seeing God in the cosmos. I think they start to see God in the different parts of their lives. And, you know, I bring up cosmos because for me, nature is always the point of connection. But I think, right, we see God really can in everything around us. Again, that person who's supportive of us, that tree that helps ground us, you know, whatever it might be. And I do see them start to make those connections.
Very good. Excellent. Amir, you and I are on the exact same wavelength, because I was going to discuss that very poem tomorrow in my own lecture. That Tars och ishke tok kan man det för mas. Zira har jag betolat det cost. That's the one you're referring to. Yeah, so that's really good that you, yeah, that's the one that everybody remembers, you know, like in any situation in life, you know, yeah, exactly. So that's really nice. Thank you, Ailya, for your answer. Now, there are two really, really very good questions. I'm going to leave Mukhtar's for the end because at least one other person had a very similar question. So that's nice to see. But this comes from Tarana. Her question was, how do we discern between submitting to God and submitting to things in the world that we should not submit to?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really, really important question. And I think Professor Amr Latif really brought this up and I'm reading your question right now. Yes, I think it really does tie into discerning, right? So I had one of my hardest cases was a student, you know, whose father was abusive towards her mother. And, you know, obviously, I mean, that's like a black and white case, right? But, you know, that's, I think what Amir said about the Sharia, right? There's God has given us a way of seeing what is okay and not okay. But, you know, there could be even like more gray, right? Situations in a bad marriage, for instance, right? It's, do I stick it out or do I not? Maybe there's no abuse happening, but I'm incredibly unhappy. You know, what do you do in those situations? And I think in those situations, it's really for the individual person to go inwards, to discern, to figure out, okay, where am I in this moment? Is this something that I can continue to bear and move through and it's uplifting me? Or is it something that I'm drowning in and it's actually taking me away from God? And I don't know if there's ever a right answer. You know, I don't know if there's ever clarity, but I think it's for that individual person to determine based on who they are in that moment, where they are in their lives, and turning to God if they're coming from a God-centric worldview, turning to God for an answer. Yeah, and I don't think I could ever give them one, but again, just bear witness as they're walking through that process for themselves.
Thank you. Now, Mukhtar has a question. He himself is also involved with healing, and he says, as a healer, patient suffering can really take a toll on the healer. So how it affects not others, but the healer themselves. What kinds of practices, attitudes, etc., do you engage in to maintain your own center and well-being?
It's a really good question.
We forget about the person, right, who's doing all of this. I mean, you're hearing. A friend of mine was a chaplain, and I remember that he would hear things, and he would just come home, and he'd be devastated. Just, you know, one full day of just constantly hearing other people's really, really, really difficult problems. So that's a very meaningful question to ask, and then you're the best person to answer it.
I don't know if I'm the best person, but I'm going to try. I think right, you're right. I think what you're alluding to is that for healers, it's hard sometimes to actually make that space for ourselves and realize that even if we're not in the midst of the same suffering as the ones whom we're serving, we do need that care for ourselves to be able to take it all in. And how do you find the balance of empathy and compassion without fully putting ourselves in all of it as well. And I think it's been a learning experience to start to put up a little bit of space between the person I'm serving and myself. Some of it, I think can come naturally. Some of it I think has had to be learned. And the self-care portion, I think it was really the pandemic that brought that forth for, I think, more than just myself. When things started to slow down and you realize that, oh, this is really taking a toll on me. And this year I'm not serving on a campus. I've taken some time away for the studies. And I think it's been in that moment of taking time away. Although I think when you're a chaplain, you're always a chaplain. There's people in your life that will come to you regardless, whether it's your students or someone else. But I think realizing that what they say about having to fill your own cup is really important. And the ways that I've started to do that for myself are walks in nature. I find nature really healing and rejuvenating as I'm coming into body practices, grounding. So having one's feet directly in the sand, in the grass. I live right now by the ocean, in the ocean. All of that is really healing on an energetic level. They say it like recharges the electrons, ions in our body even. And I think being in nature is, really being in God's presence. So that's a big one for me. Journaling is a way of processing as well and kind of releasing things that are stuck inside. We may not want to like share every story that someone's given us and then put it on someone else. But journaling becomes a container and a way of processing as well. So I found those two things to be really helpful. And then just trying to be more present and taking care of my own like health and self.
Yeah, mashallah. Very good. Thank you. Thank you. And Mukhtar says excellent. Thank you as well. Good. Are there any other? We have a couple of minutes before we wrap up for the day. You don't have to say anything if you don't want to, but any comments or feel free to share them.
Me?
Well, yes, Ailya, if you have something else to
No,
add.
I just wanted to express gratitude to everyone for the really thoughtful engagement and questions. I really, really appreciate it.
Yeah, wonderful. Hasina has a observation here based on your last point. She says, being in nature is being in God's presence, quoting you. She said, powerful and true. So thank you very much for your wonderful lecture. And all of you again for attending. It's been a wonderful past 2 days. And sadly, we have only one more day left tomorrow. So I'm going to give the floor over now to Muhammad Farooq if he has anything to mention or any housekeeping items or anything like that.
No, thank you very much. I don't think I have anything to add. But we have one more day, and it's been really, really learning experience for me as well. So I'm really looking forward to the last day. We'll also have a roundtable discussion where all the panelists or even some people from the audience can share just general views. So we look forward to seeing everyone tomorrow, inshallah.
Inshallah. Yeah, Muhammad, hang back. We're going to have our follow-up, yeah?
All right.
I did want to add one thing for some of you, in case your questions were not addressed during the panel discussions. You can save them up and bring them to the final panel tomorrow, and it'll be an opportunity for us to really, ask our questions and kind of do it that way. So anyone who felt like their questions were not answered, inshallah, will endeavor to create a space wherein that can happen, and it'll be conducive to discussion at that point anyway. So please do save up your questions.
Thank you, everyone.